Welcome back to the Unemployment Insurance Study Committee. It is still October 19th, 2021. I am Representative Kornheiser. We have Senator Srotkin and Pearson here and Representative Marcotte inside the Zoom. We had a little technology glitch right at the end of our pre-lunch meeting, and so we finished a few minutes before we intended to, so we're going to try to wrap up a conversation around the future before we jump into our afternoon agenda. And so in addition to some conversations that we had about what we would like to do now and maybe in January, we're also trying to say, what does an ideal system look like so we can ensure that the magical new UI system is able to be flexible, meet our needs now and into the future. And so we are talking about some options for trust fund solvency that Damien is going to share with us. Thank you, Damien.
Good afternoon. For the record, Damien Leonard. I just want to note that I'm really happy to say that the real-time transcribing transcribed Damien as the man. Really flattered.
The man Leonard.
But getting to the trust fund solvency. So one of the things that have been discussed is that before the pandemic hit, we were at about 2.5 times the average high cost multiple. And then even after the pandemic, we're still above the 1.0 average high cost multiple that US DOL recommends. So there are questions about whether our trust fund is too healthy and whether just like the benefits, the tax rate needs to be right sized. So one of the things that the committee had asked me to look into after the last meeting was whether there's a way to using a solvency surcharge, which some states do, or making changes to the tax structure, whether there are ways to make sure that the fund stays healthy and that we don't get into a borrowing situation like we did after the 2008 recession, but also that that we are not hitting employers with taxes that either get too high too quickly or that are slowing down their ability to recover following a recession. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to share very briefly a quick handout that I prepared on solvency trust funds from around the country. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's what I was able to find during my research in the past couple of weeks. So let me just see. Okay. I think I just lost my Zoom connection. So let me try to get back into the Zoom meeting. But the gist with the solvency surcharges is that we were thinking in the discussions with the committee at the last meeting, we were thinking about, well, is there a way to reduce tax rates, but then when the economy is really healthy, make sure we're putting money into the trust fund when employers can afford it, rather than hitting employers with a super high tax in the middle of a recession when they may not be able to afford it because of the challenges from the recession. The sort of short answer to all of this is that, excuse me, I'm muted now. The short answer to all of this is that there is no state in the country that does that. So if you look at the examples of UI solvency surcharges, which is available on the committee's website, a good example is California's surcharge there on the second line, where they basically they increase everyone's taxes by 15%, but they only do it when the balance of the trust fund is less than 0.6% of the wages in covered unemployment, or the covered employment for purposes of the UI system. Similarly, if we look at Georgia here, they increase tax rates by 25 to 100% depending on the reserve ratio. But they only do that when the reserve ratio gets below 1.7%. And what the reserve ratio is it's basically the UI trust fund balance divided by the payroll of covered employers. So again, the same concept as California. Idaho is the same thing. The surcharge kicks in when the reserve fund is less than 1%. Their program is a little bit interesting because they pay the money into an employment security reserve fund that can then be drawn down to provide loans to the UI trust fund, to provide security for federal loans, or to repay loans and interest related to UI trust fund solvency. Most other states pay the money directly into the UI trust fund. So in their case, this could be both putting away money for a rainy day if their economy is growing and the state taxable wage base has expanded. But it's also going to be paying in money when they have depleted their trust fund and they're now paying money from the reserve fund into the trust fund. Or worse yet, they've had to take out loans from the Federal Department of Labor. So in all of these cases, while there may be some instances where the money is put away when employers can best afford to pay the taxes, when the economy is strong, in all cases, it's also increasing the rates when the economy is weak and are dealing with a recession and possibly laying off employees. So I see that Representative Marcotte raised his hand.
Thanks. Representative Marcotte.
Thank you. Damian, just on that Employment Security Reserve Fund, is that part of the trust fund, or is that a separate general fund or a separate reserve fund within state government?
So that is a separate special fund within state government, and it's restricted to the permissible uses I identified there. But then the way that program is set up is if that fund is depleted and the UI trust fund balance is at a point where they're going to be forced to borrow, the surcharge goes directly into the trust fund. Just goes straight into the trust fund to try to shore that up. But otherwise, it's sort of it is a rainy day fund that's maintained at the state level to either shore up the trust fund or pay off interest on loans or the balance on loans.
So do they have the ability to write legislation that has notwithstanding in it?
Yes, that's one of the concerns with those is you could not withstand and raid that security fund. So,
Thank
or
you.
at least within Vermont. I can't speak for whether Idaho has ways to restrict those things, but in Vermont, we could certainly not withstand that. So I'm going to stop the share on this without going through the whole list.
Thank you.
The other option that's out there is a combination of what we talked about during the last meeting, where you could increase the number of tax levels within your tax schedule. So right now we have 5 schedules 1 through 5, and we could increase that to, for example, 9 or 11, which adds more intermediate steps between the low rate, the equilibrium rate, and the high rate. And then the other thing that you could do with that is to add in a provision that limits how much that how many tax schedules you can change in a given year. So what that would do is, one, it reduces the size of the steps between each tax schedule. So the jump from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 would be less abrupt than it is in our current system.
And there's an example of that on our webpage from last month
Yeah.
when we met, and I think Rhode Island was one of the
I
examples.
showed you Rhode Island last month, which is, I believe, 9 tax schedules instead of 5. Then the other piece of this is, if you limit the number of schedules you can jump in a single year, what happens is when you hit a recession, right now what happens with our current system is we go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5 when that trust fund balance plummets. What you could do is limit that jump so that you could say only jump 2 tax schedules in a year. So you go from 1 to 3 to 5 to 7 to 9. So it's a more gradual increase, and maybe you don't even need to get to the high tax schedule if it's a mild recession. The other piece is when you're at the top, if you make that limit both going up and going down, when the economy is healthier and employers are better able to pay, the decrease is slower. So you're kind of moderating here. So you're putting more money in for a rainy day when the economy is healthy, but you're also not hitting employers with a big tax jump when the economy is not healthy, and they may be facing the choice about whether or not they need to lay off additional workers. So that could help both cushion the blow of a downturn for employers and also bolster the trust fund. So that's one other example that I saw in looking at other states' systems that could maybe accomplish what the committee was talking about, with sort of a surcharge that comes in when the economy is healthy, but also enable you to lower or mitigate the impact from the tax rates.
Representative Marcotte, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Isn't our system sort of set up that way now? And it lags behind both ways. So, we had built up quite a surplus before COVID hit, and I think COVID was kind of an anomaly that we generally don't see a recession hit us that hard. What I worry about is that we especially when it's replenishing the trust fund, that if we slow down, we may be taxing less on one end, but if we're in a borrowing situation with the Fed, then we're going to pay it on the other end, or the businesses are going to pay it on the other end. So I would just, I'd like to really look at a little more in depth of what our system does, how it works compared to what it would be like with some kind of modification in it in a regular recessionary scenario.
Right, and that brings up one of the challenges with this, which is making sure that you set the rates correctly, and also that you don't limit the changes too much, because you do need to be nimble enough to respond to a spike like we had in 2008 or during the COVID pandemic, where you have a sudden plummet in the funds, and you don't want to get to a point where you're in a borrowing situation and now you restricted your state tax rate so much that you're paying a federal tax penalty to get rid of the federal loans and the federal interest. So that's one of the challenges.
Well, I think what happened to us in 2008 was that we had pretty much frozen our taxable wage base for forever, while indexing the maximum weekly benefit for a number of years. And so even when there were good years, we were still actually draining the trust fund down. And so we found ourselves in a bad situation. I think the way the system's set up now, under normal circumstances, the trust fund in 2008, if we had been doing it the way we are now, wouldn't have drained down the way it did then.
Yeah, I think that was well illustrated by the graph that Joyce showed us at the beginning of the day, where you could see from about 2001 to 2008, we were on a downward trend, even though the economy was healthy. That's definitely, part of, you go back to the handout from USDOL on designing a trust fund tax structure and creating a healthy trust fund from the first meeting. That's one of the things they talk about is you want to aim your trust fund so that it's getting to that point over the average high cost multiple of 1, so that you can absorb that recession and you're not letting it drift below that, which is what happened going into the 2008 recession, is that the fund had been consistently drifting down without adjustment. One of the big fixes from the 2008 recession is to index the wage base so that it's not frozen, because otherwise what you have is just an erosion of your tax base. Even if the rates stay the same, you're taxing less and less real dollars. But the other piece of this is figuring out the tax schedule. If you have a wage base that is consistently growing with the expansion, with inflation, then the other piece of this is figuring out that tax schedule, and whether you want to set some sort of mechanism that keeps you from either hitting the accelerator or brakes you hard when you're getting to the top or the bottom of a cycle here. So, but again, these are policy questions, and they'll be much better informed with modeling from Joint Fiscal or from the Department of Labor. And I can't speak to the health of the states that have implemented, more schedules or set these sort of limiters here that keep their schedules from changing so quickly.
And we've struggled a bit getting the data that we need from DOL to model this effectively. And so the hope is that based on conversation today, we could make more specific asks, and the department will be more collaborative with Joint Fiscal for us to model out those scenarios so we can make more decisions. I have a detailed question, Damian. In Idaho, it says payable by all taxable employers except deficit rated employers paying a higher deficit tax rate. What is that?
Oh, so so Idaho is a reserve rating state, which means they basically look at, I think that's the correct term for it, but what they look at is they take your employer experience in terms of benefits paid out versus contributions paid in. And when you get to a benefit or a deficit in terms of the benefits paid out more than the contributions you paid in, you pay a particularly high tax rate there. And those employers don't get hit with the surcharge because they're already paying an elevated rate. And normally, if I may be mixing up states here, but I believe the way the tax rate is figured out in Idaho, normally this 20% is taken out of your final actual tax rate. And so this is just making you pay your full tax rate. Versus those deficit employers are already paying this and a little bit more. So that's the way it works. A lot of these states get into some pretty complicated nitty-gritty with, you get this credit, but then you have that surcharge, and the formulas. I have to say it. One good thing for Vermont is our formula is fairly transparent and simple. So some of the other states, the formula gets very complicated, particularly when you get to, certain employers are deficit rated and others are not.
Thanks.
So, yep.
Any other questions about this?
No, this.
Any other questions for me?
I think not.
Right, I'll make way for some more interesting witnesses. Thanks for your time.
Yes, oh, actually,
Oh,
I'm realizing that we're shifting gears and you're first up for the next gear that we're shifting.
okay.
Unless, Joyce, you didn't have anything else in this one, right? Okay. Penalty weeks,
Penalty weeks. Oh,
penalty
yes.
weeks,
Okay.
thanks.
Do you want me to bring up the draft legislation or the draft language that I prepared for the committee, or what would be most
I
helpful?
think that would be great.
Okay.
So I guess this is technically my proposal. I am not attached to it. It is a starting point for a conversation around what we do about penalty weeks. There are policy questions about penalty weeks, which are about whether or not penalty weeks keep people from committing fraud. That's a policy question about penalty weeks. There are also,
What's the question? Do they?
are they good for anything? That's my version of the question, the policy question about penalty weeks. Are they actually useful? There are IT questions about penalty weeks, meaning if we get rid of them or change them, will the computer system be able to actually accommodate that soon? I think those are the two big questions. There aren't big financial questions about penalty weeks particularly, so.
Share my screen here. Okay, so the first thing to note here is you're going to see a lot of changes from person to individual. That's for two reasons. One, it's consistent with the way we refer to claimants within the UI statute. So this is just bringing that up to date. The second is we've been gradually moving to a non-gendered drafting style in our office. And so this is taking away the instances of him or her and just moving to the individual or whoever the entity is. So with that being said, you basically don't need to pay any attention to those. And I'll move to the key points in this. So if we go down to the second page here, the first thing is overpayments. And so this is the section that basically said if you've received unemployment benefits that you're not entitled to, this is what happens. So subsection C says that an individual who's liable under this section for overpaid benefits shall repay that amount to the commissioner for the UI trust fund. And then the proposal here that the chair asked me to draft would basically say that the commissioner shall waive the amount of an overpayment for which the individual is without fault and may reduce or waive the amount for which an individual is liable if requiring the repayment would be contrary to equity and good conscience. So the first piece is addressing instances where the overpayment is potentially due to a mistake on the department's part or to an error in the computer system, something like that, so that we're not, so that someone who did no wrong or made no mistakes of their own isn't penalized for someone else's mistake. The second piece here is allowing the commissioner to reduce or waive the overpayment if requiring the repayment would be contrary to equity and good conscience. And this is something that we discussed more in the context of the pandemic. When you had a high unemployment rate, you had individuals who may have been struggling to put food on the table and pay the rent, and suddenly they were put into overpayment, which meant that they were losing UI benefits at a time when they needed them the most. And this would give the commissioner discretion to waive or reduce the amount of the overpayment in those instances. This is language which exists in several states, but not all states. And different administrations have, through the USDOL, encouraged states to adopt something like this to give them flexibility. But it isn't necessarily I don't know that it's been consistent across all of the administrations in Washington, but certainly some states have taken the advice in the past and adopted a provision like this. So, are there any questions about that?
I have a question for you, Madam Chair. Is this the hope that we finish our work with a draft bill? Because this is much more than the concept here, so.
Given that the language is fairly narrow, and I think there have been cases made for these things in both the Senate and the House committees over the years, fairly clearly, that yes, I would like to walk away in December with a draft bill for these two provisions.
Okay.
Thanks for asking about intention.
It's worth noting too that this language is based on drafts that are prepared as amendments for different members during the past 2 years, as these issues have come up during the pandemic.
And if members would want us to at our next meeting, we can hear from many, many Vermonters who were stuck in the overpayment wormhole.
Yeah, no, that I can appreciate.
Yeah.
And Representative Marcotte has raised his hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're so little up there.
If I'm just thinking of the scenario we had during COVID where people were in situations where they couldn't receive unemployment and couldn't find another job. So, but their case may have been where, you know, there were issues. Is it possible that we could actually add language that would also give the commissioner authority to suspend for a period of time any requirement to make a repayment?
That's a good question. I would need to check on that. I know that our current law allows the commissioner to withhold the amount of the overpayment in whole or in part from, or reduce the amount of benefits in whole or in part, and that some states do limit the amount of benefits that you can withhold to repay an overpayment. So for example, in some states, they say you can't withhold more than 50% of the UI benefit that a person's entitled to. So in concept, I think it's doable to either reduce the amount of repayment necessary or give the commissioner discretion. The caveats are, one is just the administrative questions that the department can answer better than I can. And two is, I think, depending on how we did it, we would probably want to just make sure that there aren't conformance issues from the federal side in terms of the management of fraud and so forth. But I think in concept, you could withhold or reduce the withholding or possibly temporarily suspend it during a severe economic downturn or something like that.
Okay, I'm not suggesting we put anything in here, but I think I just want to bring it up for everybody just to think about when we get back to committee, both the House and the Senate, just to give that some thought to.
Representative Marcotte, were you imagining that was something that would kick in under certain economic conditions, or that would be sort of standing conditions?
No, I'm thinking under certain conditions that,
Okay.
you know, I think I've asked Damien to kind of draft some language prior to this, when we first started going through COVID and the issue of penalty weeks and all of that came up, would be to, you know, have some type of language in there that would talk about during an emergency declared by the president or the governor, where people are told, you can't work, you can't go back to work, something to that effect. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that there is language similar to what we had worked on in House Commerce this past year around temporarily suspending penalty weeks later in this.
I'm just looking at the language on line 11,
Yep.
page 2. So, and actually more specifically line 13, and it seems to be a shall. And so I'm just wondering,
Yep.
is without, if somebody were to get like, the computer spits out a $10,000 check and the person has no knowledge, not even on unemployment. Well, let's say they're on unemployment, but they know they shouldn't get that. Are they considered with fault if they don't call up the department?
I think if it's the department's mistake, that would be the individual being without fault. I'm thinking, the individual received the maximum weekly benefit and they were entitled to 50% of it. That would probably be the department's fault. So that would be a waived overpayment under this. Again, this is a, sort of an initial thought piece. So it's not the final language by any stretch of the imagination. But yes, if the department's computer system or the department's human error results in someone getting an overpayment, this is saying that they shall waive the liability for that overpayment.
I find myself wondering about the may and what mechanisms right now the Department of Labor has for being able to make decisions like that, and if they need more infrastructure or staff or whatever to be able to do those kinds of discretionary questions around equity and good conscience. If maybe an ombuds office is what's necessary for making those decisions.
Yeah, it's more the shall
Yes.
that I'm concerned about. And I think, I don't know what other states do, but frequently there's language like knew or should have known that it was a mistaken payment that somehow takes it out of the mandatory waiver.
Yeah, and you could always add in language qualifying or defining what without fault means.
Right.
So you could say an individual shall not be deemed to be without fault if they knew or should have known that they were not entitled to the benefit that was issued to them, or something like that. So.
And actually, sorry to interrupt, but what's I think useful about that conversation about fault is that my understanding is the report that we'll get from the consultant out of the auditor's office is going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the definition of fault. And so we might be able to apply some of that learning there.
Yeah, and certainly the department can add a lot more insight into the administrative challenges and needs that might arise around adding language like this. Are there other questions about this language? Okay, and just to make a note of it before I move on, the federally required 15% penalty on fraudulently received benefits, so overpayments that are due to fraud, is separated out here in subdivision 2. So that's not touched by this without fault or equity and good conscience, because that is federally required as part of the fraud deterrent provisions within the system. Moving on to subsection E here. This is the language that imposes the penalty weeks. Essentially here, if the commissioner makes a finding that the individual intentionally misrepresented or failed to disclose a material fact with respect to their claim, in other words, committed fraud, then in addition to the penalty, and if they're not prosecuted under another provision of the title, the commissioner would impose a period of penalty weeks of up to 26 weeks as the commissioner deems just. And the number of weeks is controlled by Employment Security Board rules. So for your first instance of fraud, it's basically the number of weeks of fraud that you committed is the number of penalty weeks that you receive. And then it varies a little bit when you're a repeat offender. But what this new language would do is it says any remaining weeks in a period of disqualification imposed pursuant to subdivision 1 shall be waived. The first is in the event of a state of emergency declared by the governor in relation to a public health emergency or disaster that has caused the statewide seasonally adjusted unemployment rate for any month to rise to a level that is at least 1 percentage point above the average statewide seasonally adjusted unemployment rate for the previous 12 months. This is language that's based on language that House Commerce considered this past year and in that case, it was to basically, it would have waived the remainder of the penalty weeks because you have this public health emergency that's resulted in widespread unemployment.
But it could also be if we had a massive storm system that knocked out half the state.
That's right. So this is a public health emergency or disaster. So if you had another tropical storm Irene that resulted in a spike in unemployment across the state, potentially long-term, and it resulted in that spike in unemployment, you could see the remaining penalty weeks waived at that point so people could get unemployment benefits. The other piece here is an expiration date for penalty weeks. So this basically says that the remaining penalty weeks are waived on the passage of 2 years from the date of determination. So if this is based on language from other states, there are a number of states that basically have an expiration date on their period of disqualification, meaning that if you haven't made a claim for benefits within that period, then the disqualification goes away, and after that period has ended, you can make a claim for benefits normally again. So this is aimed at instances that were brought to legislatures and the department's attention during the pandemic, where you had individuals who had a fraud determination from several years in the past. They've paid back their overpayment, but they had not served all of their penalty weeks. And so what happened is they became unemployed for the first time in several years at the start of the pandemic and were unable to claim benefits because they were disqualified under that previous period of disqualification. With something like this, there is the policy question of what's an appropriate amount of time to be disqualified for, and are there instances in which the fraud was so great that maybe waiving the period of disqualification might not be appropriate? And those are questions that I can't answer for you, but the instance that jumps to mind is the example of someone who had committed fraud repeatedly and obtained tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent UI benefits, and then still had a period of disqualification at the outset of the pandemic. Should that person be entitled to receive benefits, even if their last fraud was several years ago? Are there questions about that?
And I can't see Representative Marcotte, so if you do have a question, some magical signaling needs to happen.
And Commissioner Harrington is joining us.
Yes, thank you. I see you
I
again.
guess I do have a question. Damian, I know the House spent a lot of time on fraud and the Senate not so much, though it was an issue for some of us, but did we ever get, just refresh my memory, do we ever get like numbers from the department of how big of a problem this is, how frequently it happens, and distinguishing between the pandemic period and previous periods, the norm as to how big a problem fraud is, overpayments are in the state of Vermont?
I don't remember. I don't remember if the department gave us sort of conclusive detailed numbers on this. I know there were reports from third parties that were cited to in the discussion in the Senate. But I don't recall if the department had a chance to really weigh in with detailed information. I think some of that information is likely to be forthcoming in the auditor's report, following their work with the department to kind of look at the issue. I do remember a lot of discussion about just the national fraud issue during the pandemic, and the department testifying about the enormous percentage of claims that were being flagged as fraudulent as they came in, and that necessitating the shutdown of the website and so forth because it was overwhelming the system. But on a historical basis, I don't remember if we've gotten that sort of granular data on the amount of fraud and how much is recovered, et cetera.
And my hope is the auditor's report is going into depth on that to some degree.
It's coming up on the 15th?
That the report from the auditor's
Right.
consultant is gonna, but I don't think we're gonna get that report until mid-December because they got started late. It was originally, we were hoping that there would be some overlap in our time with that report.
When is our next meeting?
I think we still have to schedule that,
Oh, we
right?
haven't scheduled-
Yes, Mike, we have not scheduled that. Damon, you have a final line on this, right?
I do.
Okay.
The last piece here, this is something that was raised in the Senate initially, I think, during the first year of the pandemic. And these are instances where an individual may have had a determination of fraud that they didn't contest at the time. And this would allow them within that 2-year period before the expiration date to petition the commissioner for reconsideration. And then the commissioner for good cause could reconsider it. So good cause would be up to the commissioner's discretion, but that might be something like, the individual brings forth information that the department didn't have when it made its determination that indicates that they weren't committing fraud. But this would be a discretionary reconsideration, and then it would allow the commissioner to sustain the earlier determination or modify or overturn it if the new information, for example, pointed to a mistake in the earlier fraud determination. And the language goes on to say failure to file a timely appeal would not prevent the commissioner from determining that good cause exists. And that it also wouldn't retroactively affect penalty weeks served or overpayments or penalty amounts paid up to that point. So this is kind of an interesting piece. It's like a second bite at the apple for an appeal. If you miss your first appeal deadline, it gives you a chance to petition for it. It's no longer appeal as of right, but it's appeal within the discretion of the commissioner.
Can I jump in and offer some more political? We heard from Legal Aid with a number of their clients who had really just not been aware of their appeal period in the mix of everyday life and found out much too late to do anything about it.
Yeah, so this, from my experience working in the court system when I first started as a lawyer, typically reconsideration is something for, that you would grant for a mistake, or if there was information that, the court didn't consider, didn't have in front of it, that would change the outcome, that might have overlooked. This is also allowing individuals who may have not understood the information that they needed to provide to the department to say, I didn't understand that. I talked to someone at Legal Aid, for example, and they explained what I had done wrong with my application, and I'm providing you with the correct documentation now. And then at that point, the commissioner could determine first if there's good cause to reconsider, and then if the new information would change the outcome of that prior determination. And then the language just not affecting, retroactively affecting penalties already served is designed so that this isn't going to put the department in a position where they have to now go back and make adjustments retroactively. But going forward, it would allow the person to potentially get access to benefits again. So it's just a perspective change. Obviously, this has a lot of policy considerations that the committee would want to consider and hear from the department and advocates on. Questions on this?
Yes. So does this mean that you could take a reconsideration denial up to the Supreme Court?
Yes, so that's the language here is that you have the right to appeal as provided in 1348 and 1349, which includes an appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that's another policy consideration, whether that right to appeal is something that you want to include, or whether the ruling of the commissioner on reconsideration would be final and unappealable.
And what is the law right now in terms of reconsideration? Is there any rights to reconsideration at all?
No, so right now you have a 30-day appeal period. And if you miss the 30-day appeal period, the ruling is final. And then even reconsideration, if you were in say the court system, reconsideration is very time limited. And it's typically restricted to a mistake or oversight on the part of the judge. You have to be able to show if there's information that wasn't in the record, you have to be able to show that you had good cause for not providing it to the court at the time there. So this is a little bit broader than the rights you would have under existing law in the court system. And it gives you a second chance to appeal all the way through the process. So that's another significant policy consideration.
I am going to ask the folks from ADS to come up. If no one else has any, you have gone through the whole thing. I think we have some very specific logistical questions from ADS about this that I would love to ask, and then we can hear from the commissioner. Thank you, Damien.
Welcome. Thank you.
So much plugging and unplugging.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For the record, Sean Naylor, Deputy Secretary for the Agency of Digital Services.
Thanks for coming here in real life, and appreciate your patience while we got through that. Very specific questions around the system's capacity for some of these legislative changes. And so the three that I have flagged for you, I can take one at a time if that's probably easier, right? Okay. So if we were going to do something like limiting overpayment withholding during times of when unemployment insurance is high. So basically being able to shut off the penalty weeks and then turn them back on again. Is that something that the system has the capacity to do right now, or is that something we need to build into the system in the future?
So the system, so in preparation for this, we had some staff look through the system. There is code within that system that was suppressed in 2012 that would do away with penalty weeks over three years old or older. So there is code to what level of how it operates, right? And what are either the thresholds or how the parameters that drive that? I don't know at this point, but there is code within that system to perform that function.
That's so exciting. And so the code can be suppressed and then Unsuppressed, revealed, what is the
So-
word for that?
Right, everything we do with this environment is a little bit trial and error. So what we would have to do is figure out how to undo what was done to stop that processing from happening. So that would be the first step. And then the second step would be to go through and change, because at that time it was based on 3 years, is how do we do it based on 2 years? What we don't know yet and won't know until we get into the actual details is there variables, right? Is it either just blanket, it's either like a light switch, it's either on or off, or is there nuances to what can be done?
And when that kind of change, do you put that in the high risk, the whole system will collapse and no checks will ever go out again? The low risk, we do this kind of thing all the time. Where is that in the spectrum?
It's closer to the higher end.
Okay.
These types of changes don't occur that routine. So because there's a lot of times that no matter how we try and test individual pieces of code, we don't know what the overall effect to the system is until it happens. So every time we change code, we're at the risk of losing a day of productivity because something happens overnight with the batch processing. That's inherent to how that system operates.
Okay, losing a day of processing and having the entire system crash and not come back are
Well-
very different things to me.
So, yeah, I mean, the level of catastrophicness for.
Yes, that's what I'm looking for, the level of catastrophic.
It depends on where in the system that code has impact as to how impactful it is and how much it's going to, how long the delays will be. And it's hard to tell because even making one system change in different pieces of the code to affect that change can, whether or not where it fails can impact how big the failure is, I guess is the.
And is this a problem that money could solve in the short term? I understand it's a problem money can solve in the long term, but is there some really fantastic coder who lives in Kansas that just has a really high rate that we've never hired?
Not that I'm aware of. That was in Kansas.
Have you looked for this hypothetical,
So
really fabulous coder in Kansas?
So we take two paths when trying to find resources to help us manage this environment. We have the state staff and we have vacancies in that state staff that we're continuously recruiting for, which we haven't necessarily been that successful with. But we also have contractors that we work with that are providers of staff augmentation. So people that are contract developers. And right now that's what we're relying upon to work with our seasoned IT staff that can translate Department of Labor business knowledge into what is the actual code that has to be done. So the people actually making those changes in many instances are contractors at this point.
Okay.
So we're not leaving any stone that we're aware of unturned in trying to find the best way to support the system.
Could I just
Yeah,
follow
please.
up on that? Because I'd like just a more clear answer if it's possible. Have we tried to find somebody that could be a consultant just on the mainframe issue?
In what capacity, I guess I'm trying.
Well, maybe I don't know that, because what we hear is it's harder and harder. The system's more and more brittle, but actually what's been brutal is that the folks that knew how to run it have retired or they're out of state government. What I'm wondering is, from my point of view, we're not looking to make a change to the system every week, but as we've discussed at length, it would be nice if we had some flexibility to ever attempt it. And so it seems to me that not a bad situation to have a consultant that we would find that is old enough to have worked in this kind of coding environment or with this particular software. And I've not heard a clear answer of, yes, we've tried to find that person, can't find them, or no, we haven't tried, we're not interested. That's what I'd like to understand.
I'm sorry, I guess I didn't explain it well. We work with a contractor, and the staff that's doing the work right now are not state employees. They're contracted consultants that have this expertise. That's the same with why we've outsourced the hosting of it to Blue Hill Data Systems. They also have access to, by geography, many of the seasoned developers with this knowledge that this was strong in the financial district, so they're outside of New York City. And so we are tapping into those, but to say that we have a consultant that we're exclusively pushing that on, no, we're using staff augmentation to find contract developers that are very strong in their skill set to work for us to do these changes.
Okay,
Does that help?
I think so. Yep.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you can answer this or not, but we've been informed that anything we try and do it's fragile enough that the mainframe will likely crash. Is there, from a lay perspective, can you explain to me, is there any way of like testing before it's fully implemented that we could feel a little more sense of comfort?
We do have a test environment.
Okay.
And we do use the test environment to test all of the code changes we make. But one of the limitations of the application is it's so antiquated that even technology developers need to make simple edits to something. So if a customer service representative took down my social security number incorrectly, it may not be easy for them to make that change after the fact, and it may actually require an IT developer. So that's an example. And we end up having to use that test environment to just manage the day-to-day kind of tweaks, updates, changes in the data so people will process and get their claims. So we don't have the ability to say, okay, for the next 6 months, the test environment's unavailable to do those kind of edits. We need it to be able to test through from end to end this comprehensive change to the system. So that's the kind of the challenge. We do have a test environment, but the nature of the system requires us to use it in a slightly different manner than how you're thinking, and we would like to use it.
That's incredibly helpful information to me. Thank you. That's like a piece
Yeah,
of the
no,
puzzle I never had, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's and in preparing for this and talking to staff, one of the challenges to this system is that it's like an old Vermont farmhouse, and as the family grew, things have been bolted onto it. And often when we open up the code to make a change, from the last recession, there is, I'm going to use the term hard coded. So I'll get on my developer's side and say, there are social security numbers embedded right in the programs in order to make the system work, because in the last recession, there was this thing that happened and it was adversely affecting this group of people. So they would literally have to put those social security numbers in there so it wouldn't impact those people. Every time we go into the system, it's like, it's like playing a game where we're trying to pull this thread and ensure that when we do it, that there isn't this 4 or 5 steps downstream adverse impact. So that's why it's, the nature of the system is kind of caused us to use that test environment for on a day-to-day basis, and we don't necessarily have it to use to work out how to do some of these bigger efforts that have been proposed. Hope that answers it.
It helps.
If you have, I'm glad to answer any other questions along that lines.
Thank you.
If folks are in a period of disqualification and then they come out of a period of disqualification and we wanted to change that in the system, is that something you would do with that 3-year code that you unearthed last night? Or is that something that's already happening in the system?
Without looking at without me diving deeper into 3-year code, I don't know.
Okay.
We asked staff to understand what would be involved, and that's when they found that for whatever reason, right, in 2012, it was determined to stop this practice. Whatever was the reason for that, I'm not aware of. That wasn't in the notes that's in the developer code, but we were able to find a piece of code that does that function.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Can I ask one more question? Have you been involved with this mainframe for a while now? God bless you.
So I've on 2 separate occasions, I've had the opportunity to go down personally at the the request of Secretary Quinn to assist at the Department of Labor during the pandemic. So I have probably a little more knowledge than I would have 18 months ago about this mainframe. That is why during the course of the pandemic, we moved it from the hardware that it was running on at Green Mountain Drive to our contracted data center with Blue Hill. And so, you know, I have some knowledge, but I am not trained traditionally in the mainframe and stuff, so it's a cursory understanding of that.
So I know that we have made numerous statutory changes in benefits, et cetera, since the first grand bargain. And I hadn't heard that the computer had crashed to the degree that is being projected for this $25 that we talked about. We did ask the department to explain why there was no crashes to these multiple changes. And that's where I get confused because I'm not sure if it's a computer problem, a software problem, or it's a personnel problem. And I think someone said before that they can't find people retiring or going away, and they can't find the people to do the COBOL system, but there had been in the past other changes that have been made. You know, I'm just a layperson, but it seems like they're more complicated than ones we proposed, and yet there hasn't been a problem. I don't know if you could comment on that at all.
Without knowing the specific instances, it's hard to comment. I can speculate, right? The one is like I said, it's like a traditional Vermont farmhouse that it's had things added onto over time, and each time something has been added onto, that adds to that complexity, right? So never in the past has working with that system been as challenging as it is today. So I mean, I think there's the cumulative effect of those changes, which we struggle with on a daily basis. But I also think that we may have had some minor failures in there, but they weren't things that we couldn't take care of in the course of, you know, a few hours or a few days. They weren't necessarily catastrophic because we were talking about the kind of degrees of catastrophic there. And so I without knowing, I can't answer if they were all nice and clean, but it definitely is a cumulative effect with this system. And that's why we've been working on at least the hardware, upgrading the operating system, the things that we have influence over that we can modernize to make this more reliable, we've been working at. But at the end of the day, right, you know, that in this certain part of the system, there is 500 social security numbers that were hard coded in 2009 to be able to make the system work. That's not something that was there that they had to deal with prior, but now that's something that's a legacy that we have to ensure we're not causing undue effect as a result of the changes we're attempting to make. And I guess that's where it's really been, I guess I would say I would emphasize the challenge is that when we make those changes, we try to make sure that it's not going to have that adverse effect, right? But we don't know all the things that were done in the past to know even how to test those out in some instances. So that's where we can get hurt. I hope that helps.
It is helpful, and I hope you understand some of the frustration of the legislature in we're limited in our choices of good policy based upon a computer system. It is what it is, yeah.
Brings me to a question that I want to make sure I ask you. I know that you're actively working to design the new modernized system as we appropriate money for that. What's your deadline for knowing what our sort of policy specifications are for that system? And you don't have to answer that right now if you don't have an answer right now. It's okay.
No, I was just trying to kind of think about it in the context of the working requirements, right? And so I think of those policy pieces as translating to like the very tangible things the next generation system has to do.
Yes.
We have those for the phase one. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 4 phases that we've outlined in the modernization. So we do have those requirements for phase one, which are really based a lot on what we learned over the course of the pandemic and doing both claimants need to actually be able to know where they are in the system and track and understand and be able to, like in modern day contribute documentation and stuff. So those things are all fairly well formed at this point for phase one. Phases 2, 3, and 4 are being developed, are going to be developed as we're starting phase one.
When's that?
So phase one, we're working on issuing the RFP, I believe, by the end of the calendar year.
Okay.
And I think we've targeted 15 months for that. So over the course of calendar year 22 will be when we start in earnest getting the requirements and details for the subsequent phases.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Commissioner Harrington, are you back from your press conference?
I am.
Hello.
Afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon. Do you have thoughts you would like to share with us about our penalty week proposals from a policy perspective?
Yeah, not at this time. I think, it was covered and we saw the draft language yesterday. So I do know our team is reviewing it in terms of the penalty week piece, whether or not we're looking at a longer period of time or a 2-year expiration. I don't necessarily have an opinion on that at this time. And then obviously, in talking with Deputy Secretary Naylor, it did sound, and I had conversations prior to today's meeting, that there may be some code in the system that would allow that, and wanting to be able to figure out if that's the way the legislature decides to move, then figuring out the best way to implement whatever those expectations are, and whether or not it's a simple removing of penalty weeks, or I also heard some comments that potentially it was more like a pausing of penalty weeks during certain periods. So again, the ability to either remove them or pause them and then reactivate them, those would be I think the nuances that we would just have to figure out if that's the way we move.
And then, thank you. And then the discretion that we would be providing you to make reconsiderations, do you feel that you have the capacity in your office to be doing that right now, or would you be interested in additional staff capacity to be examining such issues?
Well, I think the challenge probably is more, or the variable there is probably more, are we managing 3,000 claims or 2,500 claims like we are right now, or are we managing 90,000 claims like we were a year and a half ago? If we are thinking, this may actually be a once in a lifetime public health emergency, then I think by the time something like this would happen again, we'd have a very different system in place, from a modernization perspective that would allow for some more efficiencies. I think the ability to review for timeliness, we could certainly do that. I will say, this is a follow-up to something Damien mentioned. So when an individual receives a determination from the department, it comes from the UI division based on an adjudicator's determination. They then have 30 days to appeal that determination. Again, this is kind of that population of people who were not able to submit an appeal within 30 days. And while they aren't able to have their case reheard at the adjudicator or at the appeal level, the administrative law judge level, they are able then to appeal the untimely decision to the Employment Security Board. So there is a mode or method for them to have their case further heard or reviewed by a higher level of appeal. for something like not filing a timely appeal. And there have been times, for instance, when I have sat on the Employment Security Board where, for instance, we had a woman who was traveling and her flight, she got bumped from her flight and was actually put on a sooner flight, and that flight happened to conflict with the time, and things were somewhat chaotic on her side trying to get to her flight. And so we ended up having the hearing, or the hearing was held at the time she was actually in the air. And so again, there was a timeliness concern from there, but we were able to remand that back and have that case reheard. So there are some flexibilities. That doesn't necessarily speak to not hitting the 30-day timeliness, but when things like that happen, a higher level of appeal can always remand back for additional consideration. And it's really more about, what are the circumstances that led to that? But again, I do hear and understand the concerns that were raised by legal aid as well about the 30 days maybe being too short of a time period for consideration.
And I just want to be clear in my question. If we're giving you, in this proposed language, we're giving you considerable discretion to waive penalty weeks in certain cases for good conscience, as well as this sort of secondary appeal process. And I hear you saying that in a normal benefits year, you have the staff capacity to be engaging in those acts of discretion.
Yes. And so, for instance, and again, this would probably be something I'd want to go back to the technical team on, right? So, my understanding is unless we were doing some type of blanket expiration or blanket pause of penalty weeks, if we were doing them in a much more selective process, there's not necessarily an automated way to go in and do that. So if you're doing, a few a week where a staff member has to go into each claim and remove or temporarily suspend penalty weeks, that's manageable. If we were talking about, needing to do hundreds of those a week, then I would say we would not have the capacity or the staff to be able to go into 100 or more different claimants each week and manually suspend their penalty week. So again, it may be more of a technical question about what that process would actually look like from the actual conducting of the work. In terms of the ability to review and make a decision, I don't necessarily think we would have a concern right now if we were, again, managing hundreds of those a week. As you remember, in terms of appeals, we had in cases hundreds of appeals coming through our doors each week. And in that case, even our 12-person team was not able to keep up with the appeals that were coming in the door at that time. So again, it really depends on volume.
Anyone have any other questions? Thank you, Commissioner. We are going to hear about one more proposal around reimbursable employers. So if you are able to hang out for a few minutes so we can hop back to Damien, and then we can hop back to you, and videos will turn on and off, and
Sure.
take the time for that.
I will. I'll be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Back to you, Damien. Thank you very much for coming today. It must feel less awkward to do all of this. I don't know what it is.
I think the less awkward way to do this was when we were all on Zoom,
I agree, actually.
but
Yeah, but we're not anymore. So
that's okay.
yeah.
Okay, the next piece brings us right back to the issue of reimbursable employers
So fun.
and profit employers. Let me pull back up the draft language document. I'll move on to the next page. So the,
Can I actually, I'm gonna sort of give a big picture framing here. So there's two issues with reimbursable employer. There might be more than two, but one issue with reimbursable employers that came up during the pandemic, and I think many folks heard about, was the fact that employers with less than 4 employees, I always get the number wrong, is that the right number?
yep, less than 4.
Do not have to be covered under unemployment insurance law. And some people did not even know that about their employer, that they weren't covered by unemployment insurance until they were laid off and tried to file for unemployment insurance. I talked to the department about the idea of a notice provision, and they said a notice provision is totally unenforceable. And Joyce tried to find out how many people were in this category, and no one has any idea who even is in this category, since they don't actually have to declare themselves anywhere. And so enforcement of a notice provision, given that we have no idea who this population is, would be impossible. And so the proposal in front of us is to cover everyone. Back to you, Damon.
Okay. So
Could I just ask
Yeah.
about that?
Mhm.
An employer, even if it's small and not gonna participate, has to file something with DOL, right? I mean, my consulting business files something with DOL every year. I think even if to just say I'm not participating. So that's where I guess I'm confused. Do we not have, maybe the commissioner could answer, but I understand people not being covered.
Mhm.
I'm not understanding that we have no concept of the universe of that.
Commissioner, do you have any reflections on the unknown universe of folks who are not covered in this category?
I will defer to the expert in the room, which is Director Wood. I do know there is, you have to file an exemption in workers' compensation. I'm not aware of that same provision in insurance, so I'll pass it to Cameron.
An employer that is not liable is not obligated to report to us either initially or on an annual basis. We advise them to register with us so they can get a determination of non-liability from the department. But if an employer knows they're not liable, there's not a requirement that they register with the department or notify us. And for those that are not liable, there is no requirement to maintain any contact with the department.
Thank you.
And so we just take them at their word. What happens if they actually hired 5 people and somebody gets laid off and they apply? Do we then go back to that employer and charge them retroactively or what?
Yes, sir. So we've had this conversation, as it relates to, misclassification enforcement, for example. Anytime that an individual files a claim for unemployment insurance benefits, if there are no wages in the system, because either the employer is not liable or because the employer is intentionally misclassifying them, or unintentionally misclassifying them, we would do an investigation at that point in time. And if the employer was deemed to be liable at that point in time, we would get the wage information necessary for that individual's claim. And that way that individual can get paid. And then we would circle back to the employer and most likely would do a full-scale audit to determine who else needs to be reported. And in that case, we have the capacity. Standard practice would be to go back 3 years. And if they were liable for the 3 prior years, we would require them to provide those reports and to pay the contribution and interest due to the department. If there was finding that the employer was, intentionally failing to provide information to us, then we can go back beyond 3 years.
Thank you.
Mhm.
One piece that I think is also relevant to this framing is that for-profit employers are required to cover all employees and don't have this under 4-person exemption. And the scale of our nonprofit economy right now is what percentage of? Sorry, Joyce, I know you pulled that up at some point, but it's a huge proportion of our employees are working for nonprofits at this point. It's not like, little charities that are working at the margins here.
If,
Amy, will you take us through the language? Oh, sorry. Did
yeah, real quick,
Cameron
if I,
use the last word and then we're going to go back to our regularly scheduled agenda.
yeah, absolutely. Just real quick, I was just gonna acknowledge that not all private employers are required to register. There are multiple different thresholds in which employers, based on type of employment, are required to be liable. For example, there's the small nonprofit exemption. There's also small agricultural exemptions. And then, there are private employers that would have to meet a certain wage threshold before they're liable. The threshold is extremely low. So I think, the general statement that the significant majority of them that have employees are required to register and be liable, but it's not that all of them, just by nature of being a private employer with an employee, are required to be liable. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. The definition of employment in the statute is pretty extensive and challenging.
And that's why Damien still gets to hang out with us. Thank you very much for that clarification, Cameron. And I had forgotten about the agricultural employees.
So let me share my screen with you. This actually goes right to what Cameron was talking about. Now, for those of you who have worked with me on unemployment issues since the days when we were having the debates about what an independent contractor is, you'll remember the definition section for the unemployment statute goes on for more than 40 pages. And most of that is because of the definitions of employer and employee. So, or employment and employee. So what we'd be editing here, I'm going to skip ahead to the relevant language. So you'll notice that this is item 9 and what is included in employment. So this provides that the term employment shall also include service for any employing unit performed by an individual in the employ of a religious, charitable, educational, or other organization, but only if the service is excluded from employment as defined by the Federal Unemployment Tax Act, solely by reason of section 3306C8 of that act, which excludes nonprofit, religious, charitable, educational, and other organizations. And then 2, the organization had 4 or more individuals in employment for some portion of a day in each of 20 different weeks, whether or not the weeks were consecutive within either the current or preceding calendar year, regardless of whether they were employed at the same moment in time. So what that means is you could have 4 individuals employed at different times of the year, but as long as you have those 4 individuals and they were each employed for a portion of a day in 20 different weeks, you would trigger the threshold. Federal law requires us to include nonprofits with 4 or more, and it's up to the states to decide whether they want to cover smaller nonprofits. Vermont up till now has elected not to cover them, but the change to include them in coverage would be simply a matter of striking out subdivision Roman numeral 2 here. And that would bring us into covering all nonprofits who are excluded from coverage under the Federal Unemployment Tax Act, but required by federal law to be covered by the states. So this basically means they don't pay federal unemployment taxes, but the federal law requires states to have them be part of the state unemployment system. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So it's a pretty straightforward change to the statute. The policy question, as always with unemployment, is not as straightforward. Questions?
So the reason that you think this provision statute is there is to give small nonprofits a tax break or a operating expense break?
It's hard for me to say. That there are 2 kind of reasons that I can think of in my mind. One is to give small nonprofits a break. The other is to do the minimum required by federal law. So this meets the letter of the federal requirements and doesn't go beyond it. There are states that have elected to go beyond it. But this is our statute as drafted meets the bare minimum federal requirement on this. So it could be that we wanted to give them a break. It could be that we just said, okay, the feds have said we need to do this. Let's just put it in statute, tracking the federal requirement.
And it looks like the language was from the early 70s.
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head, but
It's fine.
yeah, it's old language. It goes way back, and Cameron may know when that requirement came up. Feel free to shake your head if you don't. Okay, so
Senator Pearson.
So can you just remind me, Damian, the people that work for nonprofits, they have coverage, right? Is that because the nonprofit isn't just buying in differently, or is that only on a larger organization or what?
yeah, so you're only covered by the unemployment system if you work for a nonprofit with 4 or more employees in Vermont. And so this is the issue that's come up, that's been brought to the legislature's attention, come from instances where you have an individual working for a nonprofit. The nonprofit never mentioned that they wouldn't be covered by UI, and they just assumed it. And then they file for unemployment benefits after they get laid off, and find out that they are not covered by the system. So in the past, one of the thoughts had been, well, we should make the nonprofits give them notice. The difficulty is, as Director Wood was talking about, is while they're encouraged to register, they're not required to. So we have no way to know who to check up on as far as notice there. And they're not required to provide any sort of private unemployment benefits plan like you might see at a union workplace or something like that, where there's a separate insurance policy that's taken out on behalf of the employees. So they don't have to pay state taxes. They're not required to provide any sort of private unemployment protection or anything like that.
I just want to make sure I am clearly confused, so I want to try to hammer that out. So there's the threshold of 4 or more. And in terms of being an employee, is that what matters to me? Or also, because I remember learning about nonprofits that were paying sort of on the side. They weren't in the system, but they were covering people some other way. And that was causing them stress during the pandemic. But so that's where I'm getting.
What you're thinking of are, so nonprofits have the option of either paying taxes like a regular private employer,
Yes.
or becoming a reimbursable employer like the state and towns are.
Right.
So that
In both cases, the workers are covered there.
exactly. In both cases, the workers are covered. For the nonprofits that elect to become reimbursable, the issue, and that's actually what we're going to be talking about in the next piece here, is one, if there's an economic downturn, so you lose your funding and have to lay off your workers, the nonprofit suddenly gets a huge bill potentially for unemployment benefits that they have to pay. Some nonprofits have established group accounts, or they maintain a private, basically an insurance policy of some sort that pays out if they have large unemployment reimbursements that they're liable for. But a number of the nonprofits that we've heard from in the last 2 years didn't have those in place, or they weren't substantial enough to deal with the sudden downturn and the enormous amount of benefits that they were liable for, because when there are no jobs to be had, suddenly the weeks of benefits pile up, and those quarterly bills, especially if you've lost your grant funding or something,
Okay.
those become very difficult to pay. So that, I think, is what you're thinking of. versus this issue of the small nonprofits, where in that case, they have no liability because they're not covered by the system in our state.
And a small and private employer is similarly.
A small private employer would be covered and they pay taxes.
Unless they're agricultural.
That's right.
Right, so, right, and
The
that's,
4 threshold is only in the nonprofit.
yeah, I mean,
That's where I was getting confused.
yeah, for small, other small employers, there are issues with agricultural work. And then there are other exemptions that are provided through federal law for certain types of people working on, fishing boats and other, there's all sorts of really interesting exemptions in there if you'd like to go through the I think more than 15 pages of
No, that, I have.
carve-outs and carve-ins. Oh, obviously, question.
So can a small nonprofit voluntarily participate in the UI system?
There is a provision in the UI law that allows an employer that is not covered by the UI to elect to participate in the system by providing notice to the department. I don't know the extent to which anyone takes advantage of that, but maybe Director could answer that.
Well, when he answers that, is there also any kind of notice going out to these folks, like when they register as a nonprofit somewhere, tax-wise or filing a tax return, whatever, that they have this opportunity to become part of the system?
I don't know that.
Maybe Cameron can answer that.
Real quick, we do have small nonprofits that voluntarily elect. I actually think in the instance of the one claimant who was impacted by this during the pandemic, I believe her employer had voluntarily elected at one point and then decided to discontinue that. So the small nonprofits can voluntarily elect. I don't know off the top how many or how extensive. And to your second question, Senator, I am not aware of anything that either through registration with the tax department or through any typical setting up of a business where they're informed of that option. I think if they went to our employer handbook, for example, I believe it would provide information there, but I'm not aware of anything that actively lets them know of that option.
While you have the floor, Cameron and/or Commissioner Harrington, do you have any feedback you'd like to offer on this proposal to remove the exemption for employers, nonprofit employers?
So I'm happy to have Cameron speak. The one piece I would add is that I think one of the things that this provision does consider are small nonprofits who may not be able to afford what a large draw would be or a large contribution would be should they lay someone off. So an example might be a chamber of commerce or another small nonprofit that literally has maybe one employee, and that employee makes a wage that earns them the maximum weekly benefit amount. And if they were to claim for an extended period of time, they would then be required to pay back the trust fund dollar for dollar. And if you take the maximum weekly benefit amount over a 26-week period, that could be about $15,500. And so it does, from that perspective, I would assume that was part of the consideration in putting in this provision. I think from our standpoint, our position would be that we not make adjustments that require small nonprofits to require unemployment insurance and put additional burden on them. But I do think we are open to looking at ways that we might be able to have them either register with the department and also increase notice to them so that they can also notice their employees when they're, prior to an employee accepting a job with them, they would know that the position does not come with unemployment benefits.
Commissioner, am I correct in remembering that one of these nonprofits, say with 3 employees, wouldn't have to choose to be a reimbursable employer? They could opt into the regular EUI system and then not wind up with that enormous liability on the other end, in your scenario.
Yeah, correct. And I think it's a catch-22 when you talk about small businesses, because either they're reimbursable, so they only pay back the trust fund dollar for dollar for benefits paid out. So in some cases, these nonprofits could go decades without needing to contribute, and then all of a sudden find themselves with a pretty hefty repayment, or they can also elect to be what's considered a taxable employer. And in that case, then they're paying a quarterly percentage rate. And even if they don't lay anybody off, they would still be contributing into the trust fund, just adding further burden to the small employer. So, but they do, to your point, yes, they do have options. They can either elect to be reimbursable, or they can be taxable.
That was my question.
Oh, great.
So they have that choice. Do they then, does this proposal eliminate their options to be exempt from the program? And then they would have the choice of either buying into the system or being a reimbursable employer?
That's correct. They would no longer be able to be exempt from the system. They would default to being a contributing employer, and then they would have the option of electing to become reimbursable like other larger nonprofits can currently.
Thank you.
Further thoughts or questions on this proposal? Okay.
Do you want to move on to the issue of sort of the future question of how we charge benefits?
I think we might as well give it a try. We have 23 minutes left. The next proposal is around reimbursable employers and how they get charged for their rate, how their ratings get charged and changed. We are very much aware that this is not possible until the IT system is upgraded.
Okay, so this, I should just be clear, this would affect all employers. The issue that was brought to our attention and added to the study committee's charge was that with some of these small nonprofits who are reimbursable employers, what they're running into is that someone left the nonprofit because they could get a higher paycheck in the private sector, and then they were downsized. But because the nonprofit is the majority of the wages in their benefit period, and possibly all of the wages in their benefit period, the nonprofit is charged for the benefits that are paid out, but the employer who laid them off would either pay less charges or possibly no charges at all if the layoff occurred in a calendar quarter that's not in the base period. So that was the issue that was brought to our attention. What I've got are 3 different possible changes, all of which would be very significant changes to how we experience rate employers that could be considered for a future date when our IT system is able to handle these changes.
One quick question before you go into the 3 options. So presently for private employers and reimbursable employers, the chargeability from the second layoff is the same for all of them. There's no difference whether you're a nonprofit or reimbursable, or and the suggestion is to do it just for the reimbursable because they get humongous hit, or it's for everybody in terms of
this would change for everybody. one of the requirements of the unemployment system is that people are experience rated in the same manner, so that it's a fair experience rating system. But there are a couple of different experience rating models out there. The system that, and I see Cameron's raised his hand, which makes me think I may have said something incorrect. But the models out there, our current system looks at experience rating people based on the wages in the base period and their proportion of those wages. And sort of the theory behind that system is that the wages that generate the UI benefit are the wages that should be kind of charged for the experience, because that determines the benefit the person claims. There are other states that charge the most recent employer for a portion or all of the benefits, with the idea that they're responsible for the unemployment. And then, so they should be chargeable for the benefits. And I'll let Cameron speak.
Director Wood, do you have something you'd like to add?
Just to clarify one of the points, Damien, and I don't want to say you were incorrect there, but we treat taxable and reimbursable employers differently when there is a voluntary separation in the base period. So for example, if I, as the example that I think Damien was mentioning, if I voluntarily quit a private employment to go to a separate private employment, and then I'm laid off, the first employer in that instance would be relieved of the charges against their experience rating. We're not going to attach those benefits to a private employer that would increase their taxes based on a voluntary separation. That is not the case for a reimbursable employer. If you're a reimbursable employer in the base period, regardless of whether it was a voluntary separation or not, the reimbursable employer will be charged. And so that was one of the big instances or issues during the pandemic, was a lot of the reimbursable employers were having these huge tax bills come. And, one of their complaints was, Cameron Wood voluntarily quit 6 months ago. Why am I having to pay their unemployment benefits? And it's because in this instance, they're treated different than a taxable employer. Whereas in that instance, if it was a taxable employer, we would relieve them of those benefit charges. So I just wanted to make sure that distinction was clear.
Director Wood, you have a really very gracious and graceful way of correcting people while pretending you're not correcting people. And I appreciated it when it was applied to me, and I think Damien appreciates it when it's applied to him.
I certainly do. So the three changes here are changing the experience, how an employer is charged. It's not addressing that issue that Director Wood was just talking about whether or not you charge a nonprofit reimbursable employer for a voluntary quit. So this is more looking at just the direct issue of if we charge the employer who's responsible for the unemployment for either a significant portion or all of the benefits, that would relieve some of the burden on these employers in the base period who are reimbursable and had a voluntary quit, but are, so would reduce their bill. So let me share the screen, and these are not necessarily all of the solutions out there, but there are three for the committee to consider. So the first instance here is that benefits paid to an individual would be charged against the experience rating of the individual's most recent employer in an amount not to exceed blank times the individual's weekly benefit. Benefits paid to the individual in excess of blank times the individual's weekly benefit would be charged against the base period employers in a proportional manner. So what this basically says, I believe this is based on New York State's law, if my memory serves. But it basically, you pick a number of weeks, 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 7 weeks. And so those first several weeks of unemployment are chargeable to the most recent employer and no one else. After that, the remaining unemployment is charged proportionally to the base period employers. That could be the most recent employer, but it could also be another employer or a combination of other employers. So it just gives that initial liability to the most recent employer. And if it's a short unemployment, it means that essentially all of the liability will be on the most recent employer. If it's a longer unemployment, it starts to spread it out among the other employers. So I'll go through maybe all three examples and just stop me if there's a specific question. Otherwise, I can answer general questions.
A general question. So is the idea to socialize some of this cost as opposed to making sure one employer or another employer carried the full cost of the benefits?
Yeah, so the idea with this is that you're socializing among the individual's employers. You're socializing some of the cost, but at least the initial cost is directed at the most recent employer. So hopefully, it's a short unemployment, in which case it would all be carried by the most recent employer. But if it is a long unemployment, say during a recession, you're now socializing those costs among the other base period employers for any unemployment past, week 5 or week 7.
But never across the whole fund.
Never across the whole board. So it is still employers who pay wages to this employee in covered employment. The second option here, which I've scrolled to, is sort of a similar concept, but it's based on the proportion of the benefits. So 1/2 of the benefits are charged against the experience rating of the individual's most recent employer, and the remaining portion of the benefits is charged against the experience rating record of each employer who provided base period wages. Again, if you have one employer across this whole period of time, they're going to get 100%. But if you have a recent employer and then 1 or 2 or more base period employers who were not responsible for the unemployment of the individual, those benefits will be socialized there, the other 50%. So it reduces the burden, but from week 1, so if we take that reimbursable employer with a voluntary quit in the base period and then a private sector employer who was responsible for the layoff, they're basically going to be splitting the benefits 50-50 or a slightly different percentage if they shared the wages paid during the base period. But the most recent employer will be paying at least 50%. Does that make sense? I may not have given the best explanation of that.
I think I lost it, but it's okay.
Okay.
So just keep on going.
It's been a
I'll
long
catch up when I
day.
read it. It's
But
fine.
yeah, in this case, the most recent employer is being charged a percentage plus any proportional share that they had in the base period. And then the other base period employers are having a proportional share of that remaining 50%. Okay, the last option, probably this one basically says that you're charged in inverse chronological order in which the employment of the individual occurred. And then most states that have a provision like this cap the amount of benefits you're going to be responsible for paying for. In this case, I've set it at shall not exceed 1/3 of the wages paid by the subject employer during the period between the start of the individual's base period and the start of the individual's benefit year, or 1/3 of the maximum benefit amount, whichever is less. So in this case, you're basically capped at about 1/3 of the maximum benefit amount that individual is eligible for, and then it moves on to the next employer in inverse chronological order. One thing that's left out in this language, just for our purposes today, is what do you do if it's just one employer? And so most states that have this say, if there are multiple employers, you're charged in inverse chronological order. there may be a provision for socializing some portion of the costs or for addressing it if you don't have, for example, 3 employers in the chronological order. And if this is something the committee wanted to pursue, that would be language we'd need to really hammer out when we got into the legislative session, because there's a lot of nuances in the inverse chronological order drafting. And with all of these, there are various little nuances that would probably require the sort of fine tooth comb we have during the session when we can go through 10 or 11 drafts of a bill.
So,
Sorry, one piece that I had sort of missed somehow in this mix that Director Wood brought up was the fact that nonprofits are held, it seems like, are held liable to a greater degree than for-profits are, or reimbursable employers are held liable to a greater degree than nonprofits than for-profits are, which seems
So
counterintuitive.
the reasoning behind that and the theory behind that is that the nonprofits are not carrying the carrying costs of the unchargeable benefits that the contributing employers pay. So with a contributing employer, if you're a small business that hasn't laid anyone off for 10 years, you're continuing to pay taxes into the system year after year after year. And that covers benefits that can't be charged to anyone else. When you're a reimbursing employer, you're basically saying, I'm agreeing that by not paying regular taxes, I'm going to be responsible for 100% of the benefit costs that are attributable to me.
Yep, that makes sense.
So
Socializer.
you got my question.
That's what I'm looking for.
But I want to follow up. I mean, so on a private employer, right now, if private employer has most of the earnings in the taxable wage base, and the employee leaves voluntarily and then goes work for another private employer and then gets laid off, I thought I heard Cameron say that the previous employer doesn't have any chargeability, correct?
right, so
So does the short-term immediate employer, let's assume he lays somebody off after working for 6 weeks, does he have to assume the full chargeability of all the benefits, or where does that get picked up?
So it's still spread among the base period employers, but those benefits are not chargeable to that employer. So they go to that sort of socialized
So
non-chargeable.
that one goes to the whole fund.
Yeah, so for example, if you're responsible for the basically the wages that you paid in the benefit period or the base period that are attributable to you. And then if those are non-chargeable, then you can get relief from that as a private employer, provided you tell the department that was a voluntary quit. And that's on the employer at that point to notify the department that, when there's an unemployment claim, the department sends their questionnaire about the separation. And that gives the employer time to say that individual is fired for gross misconduct. That individual voluntarily separated from us and left for another job, et cetera, or that individual did work for us that isn't covered employment, something like that. And it gives them a chance to say we shouldn't be liable for those amounts. So there is that aspect.
So I understand your question. I understand there's a rationale for charging the reimbursable employer because they haven't paid anything in. But the flip side of the argument, why this is pretty important, is that they weren't responsible for the person being laid off either.
Right. So that's the challenge. The sort of challenging policy question that we've got, and I know the commissioner wants to provide some input here, but that's sort of the challenge that we were asked to look at is there a way to mitigate the impact on these reimbursable employers when they aren't responsible for the actual unemployment? And it's not necessarily saying should we do that? But is there a way to do that? So.
I believe Representative Marcotte had his hand up a moment before Commissioner Harrington did.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm by myself, so I might have to jump up and take care of a customer, but
Okay.
I think the difference here is that you have someone that leaves employment on their own, goes to another, and then gets laid off a couple months later. Who wouldn't that, if it was two private entities, wouldn't the entity that laid someone off be fully responsible for their experience rating to be hit? On the flip side, with someone that works for a nonprofit and then gets laid off, there's no one there to experience rating to absorb that. So I think that's the difference that we're looking at.
Same. Am I right that it's the same sort of principle of they haven't been paying the socialized costs, so that's why it's steeper?
Commissioner Harrington, did you want to?
I was just going to let you know that the department did internally flag this as a potential place of inequity in the system between how we apply chargeability to taxable employers versus nonprofits. And we have proposed at least consideration. Again, I don't know what the details will look like, to the governor's office for consideration in this upcoming session, to look at how we might change the way we look at the difference between in the nonprofit world, where somebody voluntarily leaves their employment and then is subsequently dismissed by the separating employer, and how that is, how those charges are covered. So again, just wanted to let you know that we had identified this and are looking to see whether or not it may be a policy proposal for the upcoming session.
Thank you. If you could let us know about that soon, that would be super. I know you all are very busy, but that would be very helpful for us if we could know that that's something you're planning to ask of us.
Absolutely. It'll depend on when we get the okay and have the details. But as soon as I get that, I'll share it with you. And I just would say I appreciate both you, Madam Chair, and Damien for walking through the last few pages of this. We reviewed it yesterday as a team, and weren't quite clear on what we were trying to achieve through the language in this. So it's much clearer now. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So next steps, everyone. We need to pick a date for our next meeting. And in addition to the fact that we need to pick a date for our next meeting, Commissioner, while you're still paying attention for our final moment, we are going to hoping to do some trust fund modeling before our next meeting. And so the more you can support your staff to support Joyce on that, the better work we can all do together.
Yeah, I will. So we're happy to help. We are not able to turn things around on a short time period. I think with most of Joyce's previous questions, we were able to turn those around in a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks from when they were originally posed. So I think if you can get us what you're looking for early on, then we can start that work now in preparation for the next meeting. I will say, though, that a lot of what was requested of us of joint fiscal was actually public data that was provided through the Bureau of Labor Statistics that's available to the general public. So I would also say in those cases, the best use of our team is to focus on data that has to come from our mainframe that's held internally, and not having our team also looking for public data that's out there for everyone, which is what they ended up having to do this last time, was calling kind of like the public sphere to pull other data points.
Thank you. Your team is quite welcome to tell us when we can find the data somewhere else and we can find that ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll work with you. So thank you for that.
And I hear you saying that a 3-week turnaround time is feasible.
It just depends on what we're trying to do. So some of it is obviously with, so we've got our labor market information division, which are the economists on staff. But if it's data that we have to pull from the mainframe, then there's, as Deputy Secretary Naylor said, we have to put in a technology ticket that then goes to a mainframe developer that then has to develop the reporting from the system. And so it just depends on the piece of data we're looking to pull and how easily accessible that is.
Look forward to a future when we do have a new IT system, Commissioner. Thank you for your time today.
Agreed. Thank you.
Calendars. For anything, we're going to go offline for calendars because we don't need to do that online because someone's going to tell me about their doctor appointment and that'll be on YouTube. Is there anything else anyone would like to add from our meeting today before we wrap up? Wonderful. Thank you all for your time.